Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. This is part of my continuing series on radicalism in the English Revolution. And my guest today is Bernard Capp. And Bernard and I are discussing a group called the Fifth Monarchists. So I will admit, Bernard, I was originally just planning on doing something on the levelers, and then it expanded. Sorry, the true levelers, the diggers. But of course, I was familiar with the diggers and the ranters and the levelers and the Quakers until Ariel Hesiod said, you should have Bernard Capp on to discuss the Fifth Monarchists. I had never heard of the Fifth Monarchists. So, Bernard, thank you for coming to educate me and my listeners on who the Fifth Monarchists are.
Right. Well, I'll do my best, yes.
Well, can we just start there? Anyone listening to this will have a sense of who Winstanley is, and Lilburne, and Cromwell, and the various, the greater arc. So who are they, and where do they fit in this arc of the revolution?
Okay, they're another very radical group that emerged out of the Civil War period. There were no Fifth Monarchists before the Civil War. They emerged partly because they felt Parliament and even Cromwell were not going far enough in the direction they wanted. And the direction they wanted was to establish a deeply religious, almost theocratic regime in England, based very much on the scriptures, on the Bible. So they've got a number of things in common with levelers and true levelers, but also major differences. They don't have a democratic or an egalitarian sort of flavour. It's much more what we would call religious fundamentalism, shaping all their ideas. Almost all their ideas, in fact, come from the Bible, either the book of Revelations or the book of Daniel in particular in the Old Testament, the prophecies in that book and some of the others.
I'm sort of jumping the gun here, which, as you'll learn as we go through this interview, I do. I'm very much not a historian. I don't think in that kind of linear way. Okay. I note it does seem that in the fact that they are not democratic is very important. To me, though, I cannot find a distinction that makes a difference whether someone is a political thinker versus a religious thinker. It doesn't matter to me whether someone says, I've been studying the universe and, reading Rousseau, and I've decided the government should be this way, versus I've been reading the book of Revelation and spoken to God and decided the universe should be this way. Both of these are political views, and you could call one of them an atheistic religion. I'm comfortable blending the two. So is there a good reason why we shouldn't with these people?
Well, the Fifth Monarchists very much blended the two. It's almost impossible to call them simply political or simply religious. Rather like the Taliban in Afghanistan today. I mean, their ideas, their movement fused the two things together. And the reason they were drawn to Old Testament Israel is they thought, well, this was a religious state where, the worship of God shaped everything. And it was the godly who ran the regime. So yes, the distinction you can make, I suppose, though, is that some of the groups that emerged in the Civil War period, many Congregationalists, for example, and Quakers eventually, insisted we only care about the true religion. We're not political. The Quakers' peace principle in 1661. Whereas the Fifth Monarchists said, no, part of our religion is to shape politics. So that's the big distinction we can draw, I think.
Okay, that makes sense. It seems to me that both and here I'm trying to synthesize, knowledge that I've only recently gleaned from brief conversations with scholars, that both the diggers and the ranters practiced a sort of anti-politics, that they had religious beliefs, and those religious beliefs had told them to sort of tear down most of the earthly forms of organization. Cromwell fits sort of in there. He wanted to tear down most of the forms of earthly government, but then he did want to create a new earthly government that was more religiously informed. And then it sounds like perhaps if I've got this right, the Fifth Monarchists are kind of on the other side of Cromwell if we're doing this on a spectrum.
Well, I don't know about the other side. In a sense, they're a more extreme version of Cromwell, I think.
Okay.
They want to tear down almost all the old institutions. So when the bishops were swept away, they were delighted. When the monarchy was swept away in the House of Lords, they were delighted. But they did want to create a new state machinery. It wouldn't be democratic, there wouldn't be parliamentary elections, but there would be what they called a Sanhedrin. It's an Old Testament institution, but based on godliness, not on property or the masses having the vote. Cromwell himself just about got to that point, but only briefly, in 1653, when he drove out what was left of the Long Parliament, the so-called Rump, and didn't quite know what to do next. And he called this strange body, it's unique in British history, it's called either the Nominated Parliament or the Parliament of Saints or Barebones Parliament. And there were no elections at all. Cromwell and the other army officers simply sat around and said, what godly people do we know in this county or that county? And we're going to nominate them. And that became Parliament for about 6 months until this is 1653, until it started going so far. The radicals started going so far that Cromwell got cold feet, and there was another purge, and we have the Protectorate instead.
For one thing, I wasn't quite sure where this was going to fit in the sequence of episodes, but John Morrill and I discussed the Barebones Parliament. That was sort of where we left Cromwell off mostly. Okay. So this will pick up perfectly from there. Yeah. Before we get into that, can you tell me a little bit about, who these people are? Are there a few names we should know and in the Fifth Monarchists, and how they sort of come to their positions?
Okay. There aren't names that the general public would have heard of today, but there were names that were very important at the time. Probably the most important was Cromwell's military deputy, Major General Thomas Harrison, who was one of the regicides, and also the individual who persuaded or prodded Cromwell into setting up this Barebones Parliament. So for a while, he was a very, very influential figure. The other best known figures were evangelists, preachers, a man called Vavasor Powell, who was a campaigner, evangelist in Wales for many years. Up until at this time, Wales had been very conservative, traditional in religion. Powell and his friends played a pioneering role in making Wales a centre of what was to become nonconformity, which remained the case right down, in fact, almost to the present time. Oh, one other figure who might crop up a bit later in our conversation was an obscure cooper, barrel maker called Thomas Venner, who had emigrated, like many others, to North America in the 1630s to escape from what he saw as the popish direction or the tyrannical direction that England was going in, and came back to England in the 1640s to play his bit in building the New Jerusalem, as they hoped. And he became the leader of the most extreme, violent group within the Fifth Monarchists, and actually launched 2 rebellions. Many rebellions.
We'll have to pick that up in a moment. I want to say, I think I've probably said this in a previous episode, but I can't quite remember, that I just have to remind the listeners, certainly not all of whom are American, but many are American, that this group of these people, these extreme radical Protestants known as Puritans, one other word for them is, pilgrims. And they figure very largely in the history of the United States. And something I learned from the podcast, the English Revolution podcast by the historian Mike Duncan, is that Cromwell briefly contemplated joining those Puritan colonies. So when you're thinking of this era of history, if you can remember the silly Thanksgiving story, if you're an American, that you've heard, these are those people, and they were in fact communicating back and forth, traveling back and forth, and with that same level of religious zeal, and then new political institutions that came out of their religious zeal. That is the founding myth of America in terms of the Mayflower Compact and Thanksgiving, it's not true. To be clear, it's not true. But this idea that our country was created by Protestant zeal that needed to find new political forms is something that will be familiar to every American school child.
Yeah. And it's one part of the American story, not the whole part, obviously.
Right. But the point, roughly, the reason why I say it's not true is that the Mayflower Compact was just not terribly important. The Pilgrim element of the story was not true.
Yeah.
Boston's role in the Revolution, the Puritan nature of Boston, the sort of sublimated Puritanism of Ralph Waldo Emerson, all that stuff is very true. But those people on that ship were not actually the main strand of Puritanism, but they became a convenient strand of Puritanism in the 19th century to claim as the American founders. But now I'm off, and you can bring us back to the Fifth Monarchists.
Right. Well, one of the people who went actually was a man called Sir Henry Vane, who became, I think, for a while governor in New England, and then came back to England and became one of the leading politicians in the period of the Republic, between the execution of the king and Cromwell taking over as Lord Protector. So some of these people who came back, did play quite considerable, important roles. All
right, shall we go to the bare bones parliament now? Can you tell us a little bit more about it and what they were, the nominated parliament, the godly parliament?
Well, the Fifth Monarchists had been delighted when Cromwell and his friends got rid of the king, put the king on trial, abolished the monarchy, and they were hoping for great things would follow. Great things did not follow. What was left of the Long Parliament, it's known as the Rump, turned out to be quite pragmatic, almost conservative, in the sense that getting rid of the monarchy was as far as they wanted to go. They were now more concerned about preserving property and law and order and so on. So Levellers and Fifth Monarchists and others got increasingly frustrated with this Rump, and they pressed Cromwell to step in and do something. He was commander-in-chief of the army. And eventually, in spring of 1653, he went along with their pressure and drove out what was left of the Long Parliament. It was almost spur of the moment. For a while, he had no idea what he was going to do next. And all sorts of strange people came out with their suggestions, one-page constitutions put into the public domain. But in the end, he settled for something that was very much in line with what the Fifth Monarchists wanted, and that was a parliament that would be based on the godly, not the propertied, not the aristocrats, not the rabble. So, as we were saying just a few minutes ago, this new assembly was summoned without any general election, just on the basis of people being nominated for their personal qualities, their reputation as responsible and godly. And it got the nickname of the Bare Bones Parliament because one of its weird MPs had the terrible name Praise God Barebones. And it's such a fabulous name. That was his genuine name. Just curse his parents. It's such a fabulous name that, of course, all the newspaper editors and satirists latched onto that and ran with it. And this Bare Bones Parliament included some moderate people, but it also included a lot of radicals of various sorts, some Baptists as well as Fifth Monarchists and Republicans and future Quakers, in fact. And they came up with a really radical program, and they wanted complete rewriting of the laws, abolish all the existing law courts, create new ones, abolish tithes, things of that sort. And they got votes pushed through the House on that basis, but the moderates managed to hold them back, and Cromwell became increasingly nervous about where all this was heading. And only a few months later, in December, the moderates conspired to resign voluntarily, to dissolve the Bare Bones Parliament and hands power back to Cromwell. And one of the other generals, General Lambert, who got a ready-made constitution waiting, and this constitution was called, would make Cromwell Lord Protector, a sort of, didn't have all the powers of a king, but it was kind of recognizable as something more traditional with a House of Commons, and later a new upper house was created as well. And this is really the turning point that puts the revolution into reverse, if you like. And it's a turning point for the Fifth Monarchists. Up till this point, they thought Cromwell was wonderful. Cromwell was maybe the second Moses. They even called him that in print. And now they say, no, he's betrayed the cause. He's Antichrist, or the tool of Antichrist. He's God's enemy. And it's our duty to destroy him and destroy his regime by any means we can find.
So John Morrell has spoken about Cromwell wanting a sort of mosaic of belief where, he did not believe that he had he very much thought he was right and believed that Providence had led him to where he was, and yet he also valued as much liberty as possible for as much religious liberty as possible for as many people as possible. So as one way of understanding, well, first of all, I guess I want to check and make sure that you think that's an accurate reading of Cromwell. And then it suggests to me that the Fifth Monarchists Cromwell wanted some blend of theocracy and religious toleration, and they wanted a much stronger theocracy and less religious liberty. If I've got that right.
Yeah, you're certainly right on Cromwell and what he wanted. The Fifth Monarchists, yes, they did want a stronger theocracy. They never hammered out a kind of precise set of doctrines which everybody would have to adhere to in the way that the Catholic Church and the Church of England had. And some Fifth Monarchists came from a Baptist background, some came from a Congregationalist background, and they were happy to disagree among themselves over things like that. So they weren't doctrinally obsessive, but they were very strongly anti-Catholic. Mind you, Cromwell was pretty anti-Catholic too. But their concern was more, I think, in building a godly state and all the institutions that would go with this, rather than cracking down on so-called religious heretics. Rather surprisingly, although they saw the Pope as Antichrist and obviously hated Catholicism, they were not particularly agitating for Catholics to be repressed or persecuted. They were more preoccupied with what they saw as their positive program.
All right. My head is spinning. I didn't know anything about these figures, and I'm delighted. Perhaps we can talk about the millennium now, the New Testament, the Old Testament, how this goes together. Because one thing I'm thinking of, it seems. So when Stanley is the one I know best, and he definitely seemed to think that, heaven could be a place on earth, and the new order was the same as the original order, the Garden of Eden, that sort of thing. He didn't seem to need a second coming of Jesus. And then you've got the ranters who are saying that there is no sin and that sort of thing. These are some very radical visions. It sounds like the Fifth Monarchists are just as radical, just as religiously inspired, but deeply different. I'm thinking totally incompatible.
Yes, I mean, almost all the radical movements of the time, maybe not the Levelers, but just about all the rest, did have a sort of millenarian strand to their thinking, which, as you've just been saying, took very different forms. Winstanley initially thought that in this new age of the Spirit, it would be almost like being back in the Garden of Eden. There wouldn't be any need for laws or institutions at all. When his experiment failed, though, I mean, this may have come up in one of your other interviews, his final pamphlet, The New Law of Righteousness, the Law of Freedom, sketched out a form of government which was actually quite authoritarian.
That's I'm so glad you mentioned this. I could not remember the name of the pamphlet in my conversation with John Morrill. It's so perfect to have this one coming out after the conversation with John, because I often describe Winstanley as the inventor of anarchism or anarchist communism. The views you get in Kropotkin are expressed, or Godwin, Winstanley expresses them in his first pamphlets. But when you get to that point, I've already forgotten the name of it again, the Law of Freedom?
The Law of Freedom, yeah.
Yes, he's very clear that there's going to be a magistry, and there's going to be officials, and there's going to be earthly rulers, and you've left.
There's even the death penalty for a range of offences.
Yes.
So, to make sense of Winstanley, you've really got two Winstanleys. The one up to and during the Digger settlement, and then the one that comes after it's failed, when he loses much of his optimism about human nature, or he realizes that human nature is not going to change anytime soon. It might change gradually over generations, living in a good regime. So the duty now is to build this new regime, and that will need magistrates and rules and even sanctions. And the Fifth Monarchists, I suppose, never had that ultra-optimistic view. But they thought they were the elect, and the elect really were godly already, but there's the great mass of the reprobate. It's a very Calvinistic sort of mindset. And for the rest, the reprobate, you're going to have strict rules and discipline. It'll be a just society for everybody, but it will need to be a disciplined society. And that's why they have this idea that they will have to bring back a pretty tough law code, one that's based not on tradition, not on reason, but on the laws of Old Testament Israel. One of them said, God gave us the laws. Can anybody come up with better ideas than God? Which is quite a powerful argument if you accept the premise.
Yes, I mean, I think I keep saying I'm sorry, but I'm just I just keep making these connections. You know what Winstanley says, and I think to a certain extent what Capp says is sort of almost, I don't want to be too anachronistic, but almost prefigures later Enlightenment kind of deistic arguments that says, God gave us these minds to think with, and therefore if we study nature and come up with laws that are based on those principles, that is in fact God's law. Obviously, the Fifth Monarchists are saying, no, you can skip that step. God gave you the laws already. You don't need to make sure that the laws from the Old Testament match up with the world as you have experienced it. If you're experiencing the world differently from the Old Testament, you are in defiance of God, not flowering with the gifts that God has given you.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, people like Winstanley, as you say, have this idea of God as maybe a spirit pervading the whole universe, all living things, even non-living things. The Fifth Monarchists stick to the very traditional image of an Old Testament image of God laying down rules. And they said, well, even the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church of England, or the Calvinists, accept that the religious truths are eternal, so why shouldn't all the rest be eternal as well?
Yes, that makes sense. All right, so what is it that it sounds like they're not the only thing in this parliament that scares Cromwell, but they are part of it. So what is it about them that scares Cromwell? What do they want that he draws the line at?
Two things, really. One is their approach to the law. I mean, Cromwell and Levellers and all the radicals wanted to have law reforms, and they all agreed that the law was expensive and cruel and corrupt and over slow and centralized. So they had a lot in common in the things they disliked, but when it came to what would you put in their place, and the Fifth Monarchist says it has to be a law code based on the Old Testament, Cromwell thinks, no, this is too extreme. We're not living in Old Testament times. The world is different. So that's one. And the other is he thinks they're potentially a threat to property when they're denouncing what they call the sort of oppressive Norman Babylonian aristocrats. He thinks this is stage one to getting rid of or undermining property in general. And one of the things they were very strong on, like levellers indeed, was getting rid of tithes. I mean, tithes were a sort of levy to fund the parish clergy, so a 10% levy on your income. But it was also a form of property more generally, because since the Reformation, a lot of these tithes had passed into the hands of ordinary gentlemen and aristocrats. And if you abolish tithes, that would mean taking away a form of property from all sorts of people, the gentry people like, in fact, Cromwell and MPs and the landed gentry in general. So that was seen as another deep threat. And those two things together, Cromwell said, no, this will produce anarchy. He actually uses that term.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, I know. The levelers were referred to as anarchists, and they were the first group ever to be referred to as anarchists. We're still a ways away from someone self-declaring anarchist, but
yes.
Or the first group to be declared anarchist in the modern world. I'm sure Plato thought everyone was an anarchist. But so I'm very struck by these two distinctions, because one thing that's quite easy to do, especially someone like me who is very much an expert on the late 19th century and very much not an expert on this period, is to find, similarities, echoes, family resemblances, the way Wittgenstein would say. And one of the ways that you can think of the right pretty easily is that the right is usually, there are certain exceptions, but usually the defender of centralization and central authority, and also usually the defender of property. At least that's how we encounter the right in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Yeah.
But these two that you've listed, it splits up, right? They would be comfortable with centralized power, but they are also against the sort of economic hierarchies and some of the class hierarchies that are produced. I'm guessing because they want all hierarchies to be produced by piety and okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's very interesting.
I mean, they do say we're not communists. When we get into power, all property owners in general, will have security in their property. But at the same time, they're denouncing the aristocrats as being ungodly enemies. And if they resist us, they say, then they will be swept away and their property will be confiscated. It's not hard to predict that most aristocrats would have resisted, and their property would then have been.
Your property is completely safe as long as you behave the way we want you to behave, and if you don't, it's not safe. Well, that Robespierre and Stalin, who are a couple of centralizing figures with a left wing economics, it seems like that fits well there. Although I raise my hand and apologize for bringing that level of sloppy analogy. The Fifth Monarchists are basically Stalin. That's something Graham Culbertson said. Please, that was a mistake.
The levelers are a bit of a mystery here, actually, because we tend to say the levelers, of course, are on the left, and they are in most respects. They even talk sometimes about a kind of national health service and national education supply and this sort of thing. And yet, at the same time, they're deeply suspicious of any central government. They want decentralization because they believe that power corrupts. That's why we have to have annual elections, even in local governments. So we take power away from the centre. And that kind of makes problems for the usual left-right categorization.
Yeah, well, I mean, at the risk of just, for all the listeners, going to absolute, primary education level civics, the supposed solution to this in political science is what we call liberal democracy, where you have all sorts of power that can be centralized, but the people get to choose who are in power, and then certain and regularly get to choose who are in power so they can kick the corrupt people out. And then the liberal aspect means certain things, certain rights are immune to power. They are protected. This is why we have the independent judiciary, et cetera. This is all, second grade stuff in America.
Levelers agreed with that last bit.
Yes. And that's why I'm quite happy to call the Levelers. They're certainly not anarchistic, but they've got the basic framework of the liberal democracy that is at least the stated mainstream Western belief of you can have centralized power, but with checks on it, with elections, and with restrictions on that power. That's very similar to people like James Madison.
Yeah.
And that's why they're not anarchists, and why I like Win Stanley so much more.
Yeah. Ranters probably are the closest to anarchists in the sense that they never suggest any structures of government or law or religion or anything.
Yes. So I discussed this with Nigel Smith, and sort of my reading is there's sort of two meanings of anarchist, or two ways you can think about anarchism. The anarchists often distinguish between communitarian or communistic anarchism, where there's no rules and there's no laws, but the expectation is that everyone will work together in common, and there can be some sort of, non-state form of association and maybe even enforcement. Yeah. And then there's the, wild punk, black flag, individual or lifestyle anarchists. And I sort of, in my rough anachronism, put the Diggers, in their first instantiation as the anarchist communists, and the Ranters, although they hold things in common and that sort of thing, they seem to be much more prone to the kind of wild excesses of behavior that is associated with this other branch of anarchism. That's
that's right. I'm sure. Yeah.
So that's why my original conception of this series was just going to be those two groups, because those are the two groups that I have identified as in the genealogy of anarchism. But this is fun.
Yeah.
This is just delightful. So what happens to the Fifth Monarchists? Or should we speak a bit more about their vision for society before we get to their demise? Is there anything else we need to make sure we cover?
We've covered the basics, I think. They like the idea of social justice, but it's all within this framework that we've talked about. They have a dream that once England has been created as a new Jerusalem, this will then spread across Europe and eventually the whole world. Idealistic. They have mixed feelings about how they're going to bring this about, though, because it's a relatively small group, maybe 20 or 30,000, we don't know, but not big enough to sweep away Cromwell's standing army. So how are they going to get rid of him, apart from just publishing abuse? One tactic was to try to infiltrate or undermine the army and the navy. If you could cancel out the armed forces, then we have a better chance. A few of them, we mentioned Thomas Venner, did think, well, since we are God's people, God will have to let us triumph if we stage a rebellion. And he actually puts that into practice. And there's a related, if you like, third option. How about assassinating Cromwell? I mean, if you assassinate a US president or a British prime minister, it won't make that much difference because there's a deputy waiting to take over. But Cromwell's regime was a very new one, and it depended very heavily on his standing and his personality. So if you knock him off the chessboard, the game is thrown open. And in a sense, that's right, because when he died, the whole revolution collapsed within a matter of months, really.
Yeah, that's a very important point that I believe Ariel and I might have discussed briefly in the introductory episode. But when you're talking about assassinating Cromwell, it's very important to understand that, I mean, it's, if you assassinate Robespierre, the French Revolution goes on. If you assassinate or imprison Napoleon, the Napoleonic Empire does not endure. Yeah. And so we can imagine a leader, Cromwell or Fairfax or someone like that, being lost during the war. And as long as their military acumen isn't missed too sorely, the revolution continues. During the Protectorate, we cannot imagine this new regime enduring without Cromwell.
Yeah,
that's very much, if you strike the head off, it's over.
I mean, what surprised royalists is when Cromwell died in his bed, his son took over peacefully without a word of protest or a shot being fired. but he had no particular political experience, no charisma, no record. So within a matter of a month or two, other generals were saying, other politicians were saying, oh, I'd be better than him or as good as him. What right does he have? And the whole thing just disintegrates within the space of months. And there's no obvious replacement. And we're back on anarchy, actually. Even the parliamentary classes started thinking, well, it's fragmenting. Order is breaking down. What or who can save us? And all they could think of was, well, perhaps we better bring the monarchy back, which is what they did.
Yeah.
Invite the king back from the continent. He came up with a wonderful line you may have come across when he was invited back, and there were big cheering crowds in 1660. He said, if I'd known you were all missing me so much, I'd have come back long ago. But in fact, it was kind of, we can't think what else to do mindset.
Yeah, so this is taking us a little bit farther afield from the Fifth Monarchists, but, I've got a historian of the 17th century now, so I'm going to try this out. One thing that strikes me is that the Elizabethan model, that to a certain extent was also Charles's model, because he could not get Parliament to fund him. You could think of this as almost a version of anarchy, in which there is a crown and a sovereign and that sort of thing, but it almost is more like a loose confederation. Does that at all ring true? If you're comparing this to the English monarchy, the British monarchy as it develops, obviously the great centralization of Louis XIV, a 16th century Tudor monarchy is actually a not very centralized and almost anarchic in that sense way of being. Please just tell me I'm wrong.
Well, I don't think the word anarchic really works there. I mean, it was recognised as being a limited monarchy under the Tudors and under the Stuarts for most of that period. But it was more centralised, actually, than most continental powers. Even the medieval English monarchy was more centralised than sort of France or the German states. When Charles came back, you're right, he's not an absolute monarch. He's now dependent to some extent, or quite a big extent, on Parliament voting taxes. What triggers the next revolution in 1688 is the fear that the Stuarts might be finding the resources or the revenue from somewhere to build up an army and turn it into a monarchy more like Louis XIV in France, which is indeed very much what Charles dreamed of and James was hoping for. They're not crushed, or the ones who attempted a little rebellion obviously were all hanged, drawn and quartered. But the movement basically just fades away gradually. And it makes sense, because all their momentum came from the sense that history is going our way. Clearly, God's providence is going in this direction. Look, old landmarks like bishops, parliaments, the king have all been swept away. So we must be getting it right. The apocalypse or the New Jerusalem must be imminent. But then with the Protectorate, or certainly with the Restoration, history is going backwards. The bishops are back, the monarchy is back, the House of Lords is back. So how could you keep your optimism alive that, we are living in the final age? It just didn't make sense anymore. So most of them just drift back into other nonconformist groups, Congregationalists or Baptists or whatever, or in a few cases Quakers. And I think the last one I could track down died about 1701, something like that. And then,
except for the two that you met in.
Oh, they're born again Fifth Monarchists.
Right?
Yes, this was a real shock at a lecture I gave in London a few years ago, when two people came up and said, "We are Fifth Monarchists," and they unveiled a big banner of the Fifth Monarchy Rebellion. But like modern witches, so they're not, as it were, descendants. They're new creations.
I am embarrassed to say now we need to talk about the millenarian element because I forgot to ever have you explain who is the fifth monarch and where does this name come from?
All right, okay. Well, the name Fifth Monarchy, it's a strange name. It comes from the Old Testament prophet Daniel, who had a vision of four monsters rising up and being toppled one after the other. And he interpreted this vision as meaning four great world empires that would succeed each other. And then after the fourth, there'd be a new age, the age of God, that would last forever. And for centuries, or in the medieval period and the early modern period, this was interpreted, the four empires, as Assyria, Babylon, Greece, and Rome. And Rome sort of still survived as the Holy Roman Empire up till Napoleon's time. So it sort of made sense to fit history into this. And from the Reformation onwards, for 100, 200 years, that Europe was divided into warring powers of Catholic and Protestant. England was obviously Protestant, and the radicals or Puritans certainly put the English Civil War into this context of the war of Christ against Antichrist. We will topple the monarchy, the Popish monarchy, and the Roman Empire and the papacy, and that will be the end of the fourth monarch, and that will pave the way for Christ. Christ will be the fifth monarch. And some thought that Christ might appear pretty soon. Some thought the millennium, the 1,000 years reign, would be the reign of the saints, and Christ would only reappear at the very end of that. It's a combination of Daniel's prophecy and bits of the book of Revelation.
But either way, Cromwell's protectorate needs to be out of the way, or it's not time yet.
Yes, Cromwell had been one of the godly paving the way, and it turns out that was the great betrayal. He wasn't Moses, he was one of God's enemies, so he's got to be pushed aside.
Good. I think this can be a place where we remind people. So the book that stands behind, several eras now of scholarship on the English Revolution is The Idea of the World Turned Upside Down by Christopher Hill. I also just want to remind people when we're talking about the apocalypse, Armageddon, we're talking about these either Old Testament or Book of Revelation terms. What we're talking about is the end of the world. And when these terms get thrown about in pop culture, the apocalypse or the end of the world is bad and all humans are going to die, wiped out by an earthquake or flood or whatever. But in, this millenarian thinking, the end of the world is precisely what you want to happen, because it's not the true end. It's the end of the world that you don't want to be in, and the beginning of the new world. So hastening the end of the world is a good thing, not because you hate people and the world, but because you hate the bad world that we are in and you are ready for the next one to begin. And the Fifth Monarchists, they were ready for this world to end so that the good one could start.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, what's interesting is the transition, because when Luther kicked off the Reformation, he thought the end of the world literally was imminent, that he thought literally the world might end in his own lifetime. That would be the apocalypse. But then as we move into the period we're talking about today, the millenarian strand is rather different. This bridging period of 1,000 years where the old world has been swept away, but a better new society, the millennium, will take its place until you get finally to the Big Bang.
Yeah, and in this sense, the Fifth Monarchists, the diggers, and the ranters seem to me, again, similar. If the new world they wanted, that is in some ways also the old world, is a very different one, they all did want the end of the world in a certain way that the levelers didn't, and it doesn't seem like Cromwell did, although he was certainly willing to push the world a lot more upside down, or a lot closer to upside down than many of the other grandees.
Yes, he was. He does believe that history is moving in this direction, the same direction that the Fifth Monarchists talk about, that a new godly age is what God wants, and he thinks he can help bring it about. But he doesn't want to turn the world completely upside down in the way that Winstanley or Fifth Monarchists or Ranters did.
This seems to me excellent, Bernard. I would say we've covered everything I thought we needed to cover. Can you tell us what we should think about that we haven't discussed yet, or how we should remember the Fifth Monarchists today? However you would like to bring this together, or whatever you would like to add on.
One curious thing is I used to teach at university level at Warwick for 50-something years. In the early days, when we talked about these things we've talked about today, students could make obvious sense of Winstanley and Diggers and say, communism, yeah, we recognize that. Millenarians, they couldn't make any sense of at all. They thought these people were just mad. In the later years, it was almost the other way around. Communism had now retreated to something they could hardly get their heads around and they thought was just crazy. Whereas theocracy, or the idea of godly zealots taking over, that was all too familiar from Iran and then from Afghanistan. It's a strange reversal. So although this world in general is very different, there are at different stages, even our own lifetimes, we can find different bits that become seen as parallels.
Yeah, and this does generally accord with the theory that the liberal democracies, which the levelers were perhaps inadvertently the founders of, when you began your teaching career, it looked at its other, at its enemy, at its negation, and it saw the USSR, which indeed honored Winstanley as one of the founders of communism.
Yeah.
And when you're teaching in the second half of your career, it is, and teaching during the war on terror and such things, the ancestors of the levelers, which we all are in a certain way, the ancestors of liberal democracy are confronting theocracy as its enemy, as its great Satan, as it were, if I can reverse that formulation. So it makes complete sense that the students saw that in that era.
Yeah. One of the story that might amuse you is that Jehovah's Witnesses, are they still active in the States?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And they've canvassed here for 100 years or more. But they used to knock on my door, and I'd sometimes get into conversation with them. And they had an understanding of history and God's plans, which were actually rather similar to the Fifth Monarchists. They said, yes, even the four great empires of the Book of Daniel, they still believed in that. But they merged the Greek and the Roman, and the fourth beast, or the fourth empire, was now the Anglo-American. I thought it was rather nice. But the end is imminent, and that will be replaced by the reign of the saints on earth, the Jehovah's Witnesses millennium.
Yes.
And they said, the book of Revelation says only 144,000 of the truly elect will be in heaven. And I used to say to these people, well, witnesses have been going for a long time. There must be far more than 144,000. So where will you be? And they would say, we'll be happy to reign on earth. We're nobodies now. We're just ordinary working class laborers and whatever. But when the day comes, we will be the kings on earth. And I'm sure that was one segment which we haven't really talked about of the appeal of Fifth Monarchists. I mean, some of them, like Thomas Benner we mentioned, was just an ordinary artisan. Another one was selling coal, weavers, very basic artisan jobs. And part of the appeal was this very vague but emotionally satisfying sense that when the day comes, all you powerful lot, you'll be swept aside, and we will be the people with honor and status and maybe wealth as well.
That absolutely brings us back to the world turned upside down.
Yeah.
So there is a real sense that although the world they were imagining was very different, they were radicals returning to the true roots and flipping the established order on its head. That's excellent. It seems to me we've done it, but I will open the door for you again if there's anything else you would like to add.
Well, you might not want to use this, but I did a book many years ago on a man called John Taylor, the Water Poet, who was a royalist pamphleteer and all sorts of other things. But one of his pamphlets was on the theme of the world turned upside down. He had a woodcut which became very famous, literally showing the world turned upside down. So you have fish swimming in the sky, the church with its steeple pointing downwards, a mouse chasing a cat, a horse driving a cart, all these things. And, it's comical, but he was playing into the fears that a lot of people had of it's going to be completely chaotic. Everything will be confusing. And he was only a working class sort of person himself. And it makes the point that although radicals appeal to a lot of ordinary people, a lot of other ordinary people were rather scared by this thought of, we'll lose all our bearings. We don't know what world will be like, and would rather cling to what we knew in the past.
Yeah, I think watching very briefly, the world was turned upside down in some ways during the first couple of years of COVID-19. All of a sudden, the workers who had received, the least credit were given the most credit. They were the essential workers.
Yeah.
Everyone loved the NHS after decades of the NHS being attacked. I mean, the world was turned upside down. And I had a lot of conversations with a lot of people who were very excited and energized. I guess I say I am one of them. And I started this podcast and that sort of thing that said, wow, this is what the end of the world looks like. And if we do it right, the new millennium can be so much better. And yet most people I talked to said, I just want things to go back to the way they were. Because for all of the excitement about the possibility of building a new world, there was the absolute terror of the destruction of so many of the good things in the old world. I mean, COVID, besides killing many people, I mean, it reoriented the politics and the economics of the Western world briefly. Yeah. It also cut us apart from our loved ones and destroyed so many of the things that we loved. And people just said, all the bad stuff from the before time, I'll take it right back. if I can just leave this period of chaos, uncertainty, anarchy, if you will. And I'm hearing that resonance as we think about these millenarian thinkers from the 17th century.
That may have come up in your podcast on the Diggers as well. I mean, Winstanley always knew there'd be fierce hostility from property owners and the clergy. But he thought that the vision he was offering, surely this would be attractive to ordinary villagers. And he was quite mystified.
Yeah.
Most of them, or many of them, did not respond. That some of them were just scared of their landlords, but many of them, I think, were also scared of losing their bearings. We've only got a small holding, but it keeps us just about alive. Will communism be wonderful, or will we actually starve to death? And what if a whole army of beggars comes pouring into this village and swamp us all? It's all scary. So let's stick with what we know.
I'm convinced by David Graeber that radicalism is really about a battle for the imagination. And if your future vision of the world turned upside down in a good way is less appealing to someone's imagination than the bad version of the world turned upside down, then muddling along with what we have will seem very appealing.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right.
All right, Bernard, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time. I've never heard of these figures before, and now I can appreciate these fascinating 17th century radical theocrats. What a strange group.
Yeah, indeed. I don't think they're coming back, despite the two people I met.
Yes. Okay. Well, we'll. Then who is going to reign for that 1,000 years? We'll have to find out.
Okay. Well, all right. Enjoyed our chat.
Hey, everyone. Sorry for the interruption. This is Graham just explaining to you what you're about to hear. After this conversation with Bernard, I had a conversation with Nigel Smith where Nigel suggested that there was some really interesting stuff about the Fifth Monarchists that I had missed. And so I asked Bernard if he would come back on the show and do a little extra conversation about some of the weirder, wilder, more apocalyptic elements of the Fifth Monarchists. What you're about to hear is that addendum. I think it was awesome. The reason why I invited you back is because I was speaking to Nigel Smith about the Ranters, and he was concerned about my poor understanding of the Fifth Monarchists as a rather dour, I mean, puritanical would be the word that we would use
Well, they
today,
were. They were.
which I understand that's puritanical is a loaded term, but he at least Nigel thought that I should ask you about the more outlandish elements, the more fantastical, prophetic elements of the Fifth Monarchists. And he mentioned Anna Trapnell, if I have that name
Yes,
right.
that's right. Yeah.
So if you could just, since I don't know what I'm talking about, and Nigel does, and when I was talking to him, he expressed doubts about my understanding, and I cannot get this, but you can. In addition to the sort of Fifth Monarchists as puritanical Taliban, can you also tell us about the Fifth Monarchists in their, let's say, their William Blake mode, if this makes sense?
Okay. Well, we'll do those two separately, perhaps. Anna Trapnell, she's the best known female Fifth Monarchist. It was very much a male dominated organization movement, but there were two prominent women. The one who's famous now in particular is this a visionary called Anna Trapnell, who was from a fairly modest background. She was the daughter of a shipwright. But from her teens, she started having visions and trances about the future millennium, the new age is dawning, and she really hit the news in a big way when Oliver Cromwell took over as Lord Protector, which she, like other Fifth Monarchists, saw as a great betrayal. And she went to Whitehall and fell into a trance and lay there semi-conscious for something like 12 days, spouting a stream of doggerel verse, all along the lines that the millennium is coming, but that Cromwell is now God's enemy and must be swept aside. And she attracted huge numbers of quite prominent people, army officers, politicians, etc., who came to see and listen to all this. And it was put into print. Somebody took it down in shorthand. It was transcribed and printed, and she became a sort of celebrity in the movement and was carted off down to all the way down to Cornwall to stoke up resistance, and was eventually arrested by the government. But what's fascinating about people like her, and there were lots of other visionaries, women visionaries, Quakers, Baptists, and so on, is that they didn't have any or much in the way of book learning. They knew the Bible back to front, but they had no much education. But they said, well, that doesn't matter. In effect, we have a hotline. God speaks directly. So it doesn't matter that you have a degree and I don't, because I have God's personal word for what I'm saying.
Okay, well that's wonderful. I mean, this is precisely what was precisely the thing that Nigel was explaining to me that I didn't understand, because I was thinking of the Fifth Monarchists in a sort of, Cotton Mather mode, this very learned, dour academic, which of course is a side of this Puritan movement. And I was imagining all of these men, everyone has seen the images of the people and they're all wearing black with maybe a white collar. But if we've got prophetesses in a trance for 12 days spouting visions from Revelation, and I had it wrong.
Right, okay. And they didn't all, in fact, wear black. Major General Harrison, who I think we mentioned in our previous chat, like dressing up in gaudy cloaks, crimson cloak and yellow this and so forth. So there's a flamboyant side as well, I guess, to all this.
Oh, That's wonderful. I mean, this is why I mentioned Blake. My job, and this is why it's always tricky when I talk to people like you who truly know the period, is to make connections between what I know and what you know, and there's always the
Sure.
chance of a miscommunication, right? But this, first of all, this enthusiastic mode sounds like something like the Great Awakening. Sounds
Yeah,
very
yeah, yeah.
romantic.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
That's why I mentioned Blake.
There's another woman who's worth mentioning, even though she doesn't have the same appeal to current writers and feminists that Anna Trapnell does. There's a woman called Mary Carey. We don't know much about her, but she published a couple of, of pamphlets or short books. What's interesting about her is that she didn't claim any visions. She said that she could operate on the level of biblical criticism just as well as any male figures. So in a way, that was more subversive. You know, with visionaries, you can either say, well, they're odd creatures, perhaps they're bogus, perhaps they're whatever. But she saw herself as a serious, rational analyst. And she, again, spelt out her vision of the Fifth Monarchy. And you mentioned Blake, and hers is quite interesting because she comes up with suggestions like it'll be a bit like going back to the Garden of Eden. It'll be the weather will always be fine and the harvest will be fine. It'll always be summer. Animals and birds will all live in harmony together. You know, the lion literally lying down with the lamb. And perhaps the most striking thing is, well, several. One is that she said, sickness will go, we'll all live to be 100. Optimistic spirit there. Babies will survive. You know, women will not lose their babies in infancy, that they'll survive. And taxes will disappear. That was a very popular thing right across the Fifth Monarchist movement. You know, there'll be no need for taxes.
Okay, again.
So there's a populist element in the Fifth Monarchist movement as well as the stuff we got into perhaps last time.
Yes, Nigel was so perceptive again because I missed this. So again, making these connections. I mean, I just have to mention in terms of flamboyant dressers, the legendary 19th century anarchist Oscar Wilde was one of the was a flamboyant dresser. So and the image of the Fifth Monarchist that I had before would certainly not have any connection to Oscar Wilde. And when you're talking about Garden of Eden, we can think, of course, of people like Winstanley, but there's also in the sort of Tolstoy, Kropotkin, William Morris tradition of anarchism, this idea of this return to when there were no taxes. Absolutely, I was setting up the Fifth Monarchists as sort of the opposite of an anarchic form of radicalism, but it's Nigel has steered me straight back to you for the somewhat the ways that they would leap out of and beyond and have resonances with these various romantic forms of radicalism that come later. Thank you so much for coming back.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of split movement, or split personality, if you like, because that authoritarian strand is there. They're saying, we want to go back to the laws of Moses in the Old Testament. They were the laws handed down by God, so they're forever, and they're pretty draconian. And yet there's other dimension as well, a much more humane and populist, romantic, if you like, strand.
Yes, I understand I'm being anachronistic, but again, that's my job. That's my job here is to be anachronistic, and you're to set me straight. This came up again. My conversation with Nigel, and that my image of Winstanley is, and you and I spoke about this briefly, is of the Winstanley before the that final pamphlet that brings the death penalty in.
Yeah.
Yes,
and that's when he switches to the more authoritarian style. Yeah,
precisely. So Winstanley also, who I want to hold up as the greatest anarchist in this tradition and the first modern anarchist, you can also read him in this dour authoritarian way.
Yeah.
And now we're just in this classic radical problem where we have all of these people, you name them, Marx, Robespierre, Lenin, who claim to be speaking for the people and in the name of freedom, and also have these authoritarian elements. It seems to be almost unavoidable.
Yeah, well, I mean, the early Winstanley was still optimistic, but partly because he got his own version of millenarian ideas. The idea a new age is coming, people will be transformed, and so we won't need laws and authorities and anything else. And then, of course,
Or taxes,
or
presumably.
taxes indeed, yeah. But then the new age does not arrive, and he finds
Yeah.
that human nature hasn't suddenly changed overnight. So what do you do instead? Well, he hasn't given up his dream of the perfect society, but now we've got to sort of educate or inculcate these new values into people, and that will mean making them live under laws until they're transformed by the benefit of living in a good society. And which brings him back to more or less where Thomas More was in Utopia.
Hmm.
More likes the idea of freedom, but thinks, well, it'll take a long while for human nature to change and develop to get to where they'll do it voluntarily. So in the meantime, we'll still need regulations and laws and authorities.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's especially dangerous to be bringing up Lenin and Stalin in these conversations. But
Yeah,
Lenin certainly was a Marxist who thought that he didn't want to wait for the proletariat
yeah,
to, or
yeah,
rather he didn't want to wait for the bourgeoisie to overthrow the proletariat in the sort of
yeah.
natural course of things, and for the proletariat
Mhm.
eventually to realize. And he thought, well, we can do it for them, and then
Yes,
we can educate them
yeah, yeah,
until they're ready. It's just a radical impulse, it seems like.
yeah. We'll force them to be free. It's in their interest. They
Yeah.
don't know they want it
Yes.
yet, but they will know in due course that this is what they wanted all along.
Yes, and this is my intervention that I'm trying to do in the anarchist tradition, is to say, I mean, this is why I claim an anarchist label rather than anything else. Is it seems to me you always go down a dangerous road when you want to try and force people
Yeah.
to be free.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's right. And there's no way around that.
No, I don't think there is, and that's the sort of anarchist claim, is you can't make people be free, and this is why you get these terms like prefigurative. If you want a free revolution, if you want a free society, the revolution has to be based on freedom, not authority. And then, well, here I'll throw out another tricky one for you. Strangely, ironically, Oliver Cromwell ends up, as long as you're not Irish, um, more willing to let people work towards their own education and freedom than many of these other groups. Have I got that wrong?
um, no, I think you're right. I mean, he's undoubtedly a Puritan, but he refuses to sign up to any individual movement or church or denomination. He's willing to say, there are really good, decent people who are Presbyterians or Quakers or early Fifth Monarchists before they changed their mind, um, Independents, Baptists. And although most of these other groups all say, we have the monopoly of the truth, we are the right group, all the rest are wrong, he turns around and says, no, who knows for sure? There's goodness in all these different groups.
Oh my.
Let's be tolerant. I mean, it only goes so far. He doesn't say,
Sure.
we'll allow Roman Catholics to have equality and so on. But nonetheless, he's more tolerant than most of his contemporaries. And when you did the Quakers, you probably got onto the case of James Naylor. This
I
guy.
so
And
we I can't remember if we
he-
discussed James Naylor, but I'm speaking to Kate in about an hour for another go at the
oh,
Quaker, so I'll make sure.
well, James Naylor was almost the co-leader, and some of his followers decided, well, maybe he's more than just a human being. He's sort of almost Christ-like,
Mm.
and he goes riding into Bristol on a donkey, almost imitating or doing the same as Christ into Jerusalem. And Parliament is horrified by this, and they prosecute him for blasphemy and they bore a hole through his tongue, they brand his forehead with a
Mm.
red hot iron. And Cromwell is very uneasy about that. It's
Mhm.
the MPs who are pressing to either kill him or torture him or whatever. And Cromwell is very uncomfortable. Says, "No, that's going too far." So
Yeah.
Cromwell's not a liberal, but he's actually more liberal than most Puritans or most Royalists and Episcopalians, for that matter.
Yeah, this is fascinating. I began this entire series with Ariel Hession laying my theory out that Cromwell fits in the Napoleon Lenin place, and in some ways he does, and in some ways he's the end. I've inverted it now completely.
All right, yeah.
All right, we'll end it again. This has been Bernard Capp, and although I have to say, for all of everything wonderful about Cromwell and the Fifth Monarchists, were the Fifth Monarchists also against Christmas?
Oh, they're including Cromwell. They're all against Christmas. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Well, then we can't. Then we can't love them too much. All right. Thank you again, Bernard. I truly appreciate it.
Right, so good luck then. Yeah. Bye then.